What is up, people? Welcome back. This is probably the most intimidating unit in macro, but stick around and you'll see it's not so bad. And don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe while the music plays. Hey, before we start, click the link in the description to get notes to follow along with this video. Okay, so there's a ton of new material in this unit and it's all centered around money. An advantage to money is how liquid it is. Liquidity refers to how quickly a financial asset can be converted to cash without losing value. And since money includes cash, pretty much by definition, money is the most liquid financial asset there is. Now, the reason people might opt to hold less liquid financial assets is that they offer a higher rate of return. For example, the return on cash is zero. You don't earn any interest for the cash that's sitting in your pocket. Money in savings accounts or time deposits usually offer a little bit of interest in exchange for less liquidity. As a general rule, liquidity and rate of return are often negatively or inversely related. Other financial assets include stocks and bonds. Stocks refer to shares of ownership of a company, while bonds are an interest-bearing asset that enable people to lend money to companies and to governments. The opportunity cost of holding money is the interest that could have been earned from holding other financial assets such as bonds. Remember trade-offs and opportunity cost? Well, they're back. Now, money is nice because we can easily trade it for other stuff, but by holding our assets as money, we're giving up the ability to earn interest if we were holding bonds or something else instead. Speaking of bonds and interest rates, the price of previously issued bonds and interest rates are negatively or inversely related. On a test question, if they ever ask you what happens to bond prices, just figure out what happens to interest rates, and then you'll know that the opposite happens to bond prices, and you'll be all set. While we're on the subject of interest rates, let's briefly go over nominal and real interest rates. Nominal interest rates are unadjusted for inflation, while real interest rates take inflation into account. The real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation rate. For example, if the expected inflation rate is 4%, and the nominal interest rate is 5%, it gives us an expected real interest rate of 1%. The actual real interest rate can obviously only be calculated after the fact once you know what happened to inflation. Okay, so now let's go back to money and define it as any asset that's accepted as a means of payment. This primarily includes currency in circulation or cash and demand deposits. And that definition of money helps us to start to explore the functions of money, of which there are three. Money acts as a medium of exchange, facilitating trade since people are willing to provide goods and services to you in exchange for money that they can then use to exchange for something else that they want. Money also serves as a unit of account, allowing us to easily compare the relative value of different things like concert tickets, bags of Skittles, and an iPhone. And thirdly, money functions as a store of value, meaning that it maintains its value over time. So when you save money for the future, it's acting as a store of value. Okay, let's finish this section up with a few more definitions, but pay attention because these terms will be all over the rest of this unit. The money supply refers to the total amount of money in an economy. Terrible definition, but whatever. What's more important is that there are different ways we can measure the money supply depending on which financial assets we decide to include as money or not. The M1 definition of the money supply is a narrow definition that only includes the most liquid assets, currency in circulation or cash, demand deposits, and savings deposits. The M2 definition is broader. It includes all of M1 as well as time deposits and money market funds. These are considered near monies, meaning that they aren't money, but they are relatively liquid and can quickly be converted into currency or demand deposits. And then there's the monetary base, which can be labeled M0 and equals currency in circulation plus bank reserves. Bank reserves refer to money banks have but haven't lent out. Here's a Venn diagram that shows the overlap between the money supply and the monetary base. They both include currency, whereas the money supply includes demand deposits and the monetary base includes bank reserves. This is going to be very important in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about money creation. I know that everybody assumes that governments create money when money printer goes brrrr, but the real story is a bit more complicated. I'm going to tell you the punchline and then explain how we got there. Banks create money by making loans. The US has a fractional reserve banking system, which means that banks must keep a percentage of deposits as reserves, and they can lend out the rest. And we just defined this, but as a reminder, bank reserves refer to money that banks have but haven't lent out, and they keep on hand in vaults or they deposit at the Federal Reserve. The primary way banks earn profits is by making loans. So the idea is that they take deposits from the public, and then turn around and lend most of that money to other people. So a well-functioning financial system brings together savers and borrowers, facilitating the lending and borrowing of money. Let's take a look at a simplified version of a bank's balance sheet to help walk us through this process. A bank's balance sheet or T account is organized into two parts: assets and liabilities. Assets on the left side refer to things the bank owns or that can be converted to cash, while liabilities on the right side represent money the bank has promised to pay somebody else. It's called a balance sheet because assets equal liabilities. So we need to make sure our sheet is always balanced, where total assets equal total liabilities. All right, assume that Frodo deposits $100 in the bank. From the bank's perspective, since Frodo can walk back into that bank and demand his $100, deposits are a liability. So deposits will always go on the liability side of a bank's balance sheet. But we also know that we need assets to equal liabilities. And since liabilities increase by $100, the same thing has to happen on the asset side. The $100 also represents an asset for the bank because it's now holding $100 in reserve. So the $100 is simultaneously an asset and a liability for the bank. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that this is part of a fractional reserve system. In the US, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, sets the required reserve ratio, the percentage of deposits that the bank must keep on reserve and isn't allowed to lend out. So on our balance sheet, we can either have total reserves listed like this, or we can divide those reserves into required and excess reserves. Required reserves are the reserves a bank must keep and isn't allowed to lend out, while excess reserves are reserves above the required reserves that banks can lend out. And since banks make money by making loans, for now, we're going to assume that banks lend all excess reserves. Assume the reserve requirement is 10%. The bank has to keep 10% of the deposits on reserve and can lend the other 90%. So we can rewrite our assets column and say that required reserves equal $10 and excess reserves equal $90. What happens next is that we assume the bank lends out the $90 of excess reserves. Excess reserves are the basis for an expansion of the money supply. Remember what I said earlier, when banks make loans, they create new money. Therefore, we can conclude that a dollar deposited into a bank will lead to a total increase in the money supply by an amount greater than $1. Thankfully, to calculate how much the money supply increases as a result of a deposit, we just use the money multiplier, which equals 1 divided by the reserve requirement. So we could just say that it's the reciprocal of the reserve requirement. In our example, we've been assuming that the reserve requirement is 10% or 1/10, so 1 over 1/10 equals 10. So the money multiplier is 10. Our initial deposit was $100, so 100 times our multiplier 10 equals $1,000. In other words, from Frodo's initial $100 deposit, 900 additional dollars are created. See? I told you, banks create money, and now you've seen how. Alright, so now let's go ahead and get into our money market, one of our 3 new models in Unit 4. The x-axis is the quantity of money, and the y-axis is the nominal interest rate. And I sometimes use a lowercase r as my variable for nominal interest rate. My advice is that on an exam or an AP test, go ahead and write out the words or at least put NIR, but anyway, this is the inflation rate that isn't adjusted for inflation. The nominal interest rate represents the cost of holding money, and we'll talk more about that shortly. Next, here are the curves, and as usual we have a supply and demand curve, and there are different ways to label them, but I refer to the curves as money supply and money demand, so I label them MS and MD. By the way, we can also call the money market model the liquidity preference model, since the model demonstrates our preference for liquid assets like money against less liquid assets like bonds. I'm sure the thing that jumps off the screen at you is the vertical money supply curve. And this tells us that there's no relationship between the nominal interest rate and the quantity of money supplied. The reason it's vertical is that the nation's central bank, in the US, the Federal Reserve, determines the monetary base, which in turn determines the money supply. So the Fed simply chooses the quantity of money that they believe is appropriate. They're not a seller chasing profits. Like most demand curves, the money demand curve is downward sloping. Like we said at the very beginning of this video, we demand money so that we can buy stuff. The drawback to holding all our wealth as money is that money earns little or no interest. Therefore, the opportunity cost of holding money is the interest we could have earned but are foregoing. The MD curve is downward sloping because as the nominal interest rate decreases, the opportunity cost of holding money also decreases, so we demand a greater quantity of money. We have 4 things that shift the MD curve. The first 2 are by far the most important. We'll start with changes in price level. When the price level rises, that means there's been inflation, so things cost more. And since things are more expensive, we now need more money to buy the same things that we were buying before prices rose. As a result, our demand for money increases, shifting the MD curve to the right, pushing up the nominal interest rate. If the price level falls, we wouldn't need as many dollars, so MD would decrease, shifting left and reducing the nominal interest rate. Next is real GDP, and it's pretty similar. When real GDP increases, it means more stuff is being bought, so we demand more money to buy more stuff, and MD shifts right. And when real GDP falls, we don't demand as many dollars when less stuff is being bought, so the MD curve shifts left. By the way, this means that a change in AD affects the demand for money, since AD affects the price level and real GDP. Another shifter is changes in banking policies that make it easier or tougher for us to get money. For example, having access to ATMs or banking apps make it easier for us to get our money, so we actually demand less money when it's easier to get. I know that sounds weird, but basically, since we know we can get money easily when we need to, we don't get more money than we need just in case, so we let our assets earn interest instead of unnecessarily holding extra money. When it's tougher to get money, we demand more money. And lastly, if banks offer interest on the money in your checking account, this increases the demand for money because it reduces the opportunity cost of holding money, which by now we all know is the foregone interest we could have been earning. So this shifts the MD curve to the right. Okay, so now I want us to get back to the money supply curve. But in order to do that, we really have to take another step back and learn about monetary policy first, and then we can come back and graph it. Monetary policy is basically managing the money supply and interest rates, and is conducted by a nation's central bank. In the US, the Federal Reserve, often referred to simply as the Fed, conducts monetary policy. The Fed has a dual mandate from Congress to achieve price stability and maximum sustainable employment. Put more simply, the Fed is supposed to manage inflation and help move the economy towards the full employment level of output. The next thing I want you to notice is that when the money supply increases, nominal interest rates fall, and when the money supply decreases, nominal interest rates rise. So there ends up being a negative relationship between the supply of money and the nominal interest rate. Remember, we're assuming that only actions of the Federal Reserve change the money supply. The Fed sets the monetary base, currency plus bank reserves, and since we assume that banks lend out all excess reserves, the Fed has such tremendous influence over the money supply that it's often said that the Fed sets the money supply. Now, here's the plot twist. Banks don't always lend out excess reserves, and monetary policy is conducted differently depending on whether we're in an economy with limited or ample reserves. An economy with limited reserves is what it sounds like. Banks lend out basically all the reserves that they're allowed to, keeping only the required reserves, but lending all other dollars. In an economy with ample reserves, banks keep lots of reserves on hand regardless of any reserve requirement. And because of this difference in reserves, central banks will use different policy tools, or some tools differently, depending on what type of reserve world they're living in. Listen, there's a ton of info in this section. Don't let it overwhelm you. It's probably the most challenging thing we do in this whole course, but be patient and stick with it. You can do this. All right, so let's talk about the tools of monetary policy, and let's assume that we're in a limited reserve economy. In this case, the Fed's three policy tools are the reserve requirement, the discount rate, and open market operations. Let's start with the reserve requirement since we've already discussed it. The Fed determines the percentage of bank deposits that banks can't lend out and must keep on reserve. When the reserve requirement is lower, banks can make more loans and the money supply increases, shifting the money supply curve to the right, decreasing nominal interest rates. On the other hand, if the Fed raises the reserve requirement, banks can't make as many loans, so the money supply decreases, shifting left and raising the nominal interest rate. The Fed can also change the discount rate, which is the interest rate the Fed charges banks to borrow money overnight. A higher discount rate discourages banks from borrowing from the Fed, decreasing the money supply and raising interest rates, while a lower discount rate encourages borrowing, increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates. The Fed also influences but does not directly set the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate charged for overnight loans between banks. Banks constantly borrow from each other, so this is a very robust market. The Fed targets a range of interest rates, most commonly within a half a percentage point of each other. Now, the way the Fed hits their federal funds target rate is by using their third tool, by far the most commonly used tool in a limited reserve economy, and that is open market operations. This means that the Fed buys and sells securities, most often treasury bonds, on an open market, most commonly with other banks. In order to increase the money supply, the Fed would make open market purchases, meaning that they buy bonds, and this pushes the nominal interest rate down. If they want to decrease the money supply and raise interest rates, they conduct open market sales, meaning that they sell bonds. When the Fed makes an open market purchase, they receive the bonds and the bank gets money from the Fed, increasing the bank's reserves. We can see this on the balance sheet. Before the open market purchase, the bank had $1 million worth of securities. After, they no longer have the securities, but now they have $1 million in excess reserves that they can now lend out. And in this way, the money supply increases. So let's take a look at a model of the reserve market, because what happens on this market directly impacts what happens on the money market model that we're already used to. Okay, the y-axis is the federal funds rate, which we just learned is what the Fed is targeting when they make open market operations. It's the interest rate banks charge other banks for overnight loans. The x-axis is the quantity of reserves. We have a vertical supply curve, which we'll label SR. It's vertical since the central bank has direct control over the quantity of reserves in the banking system at any given time. Now here comes the demand curve, and stay with me, don't panic, I know it's scary looking. We'll label it DR for the demand for reserves. I think we immediately notice that there are 3 distinct sections of the demand curve. So let's go through each one of these sections one at a time, and it won't be so bad, I promise. The first section is the discount rate. The reason the demand curve never goes above the discount rate is because this is the interest rate the Fed will lend to banks at. So why would any bank ever pay a higher interest rate to another bank? For example, if the discount rate is 4%, why would my bank ever pay you 6%? I wouldn't. So the discount rate effectively sets a ceiling for how high the federal funds rate can be. It won't be higher than the discount rate. Next is the downward sloping section of the demand curve, and this represents economies with limited reserves like we've been discussing. The most common way the Fed changes the quantity of reserves is by making open market purchases and sales. An open market purchase increases the supply of reserves, shifting the curve to the right, and decreases the federal funds rate just like the Fed intended. And for completion's sake, an open market sale by the Fed would shift the supply curve left, raising the federal funds rate. On our money market model, the money supply curve shifts right when the federal funds rate falls. The third section of the demand curve represents an economy with ample reserves. And notice what happens if we're in this section and the Fed conducts an open market purchase. The federal funds rate is unchanged. Same thing with an open market sale. No change in the federal funds rate. That means that in ample reserve economies, open market operations do not affect the money supply or nominal interest rates. Open market operations are still used, however, their purpose is merely to maintain sufficient levels of ample reserves, to make sure that the reserves stay in this third section of the demand curve. This means you're going to have to read questions carefully that mention open market operations, because their purpose and effectiveness depend entirely on whether there are limited or ample reserves. What we know for sure is that open market purchases increase reserves and the monetary base, and that open market sales decrease reserves and the monetary base. There are 2 tools that central banks use in conjunction in ample reserve economies to change the money supply and interest rates. The central bank can change its administered interest rates. That's just a jargony way to say that an interest rate is set directly by the central bank. And in an ample reserves world, there are 2 of these: discount rates and interest on reserves. We've already talked about discount rate, which is what the Fed charges banks for overnight loans. Interest on reserves refer to interest that the Fed pays banks for their reserves. Think of the Fed as like a bank for banks, and the Fed pays banks interest for their reserves. On our reserve model, the horizontal section of the demand curve at the bottom represents the interest on reserves that the Fed is paying. This interest rate acts as a floor for the federal funds rate that it won't fall beneath. Since the Fed is paying that interest rate, why would any bank ever accept a lower interest rate when they're lending to another bank? And they wouldn't. So just like the discount rate sets a ceiling to the federal funds rate, the interest on reserves act as a floor to the federal funds rate. So to change the federal funds rate in the ample reserve world, all the Fed actually has to do is change their administered interest rates. If they want a lower federal funds rate, then they would decrease the discount rate and the interest on reserves. On our model, both interest rates decrease, and look at that, we have a new lower federal funds rate now. Let's go ahead and get the money market model back on the screen and point out that in an ample reserve economy, lowering the administered interest rates increases the money supply and lowers the nominal interest rate. If the Fed wants to raise nominal interest rates, they do the opposite. raise the discount rate and raise the interest on reserves, and that would increase the federal funds rate, which then over on our money market model shifts the money supply curve left, raising the nominal interest rate. Okay, you're still here, you're still alive, you're doing amazing so far, and you just survived the toughest part. All right, so let's finish up with monetary policy. Monetary policy, just like fiscal policy, can be either expansionary or contractionary. The purpose of expansionary monetary policy is to increase output and reduce unemployment, and should be employed when the economy is in a recessionary gap. We'll use our money market and ADAS models to show this. Okay, so first the money supply curve shifts right, lowering the nominal interest rate. Then this is going to increase interest-sensitive spending like consumer and investment spending. Basically, it's cheaper to borrow money, so consumption and investment spending both increase. And this shifts the AD curve to the right, bringing the economy back to long-run equilibrium. Contractionary monetary policy is used to bring down inflation when the economy is in an inflationary gap, and it's just the reverse of expansionary policy. The money supply curve shifts left, raising the nominal interest rate. This decreases interest-sensitive spending like consumption and investment, and this shifts the AD curve to the left, again bringing the economy back to long-run equilibrium. On the screen you have the various specific expansionary monetary policies. Again, keep in mind whether it's a limited or ample reserve economy. Pause the video if you want to jot these down. Okay, one last model and we're done with this unit. The loanable funds model brings together borrowers and savers. By the way, please realize that loanable funds don't refer to all the money in an economy. It's specifically the money that's available to be lent and borrowed. The x-axis is quantity of loanable funds, and the y-axis is the real interest rate, which represents the real cost of money. Our supply and demand curves look totally normal, which is awesome. The supply curve represents savers and lenders who prefer high interest rates. The supply curve will shift to the right if there's an increase in savings, and it'll shift left if there's a decrease in savings. Now, this could be because of a change in private savings, meaning that households save more or less money, but it could also be because of a change in public savings, which refers to governments and equals tax revenue minus government spending. When governments run a budget surplus, it means that public savings are positive, shifting the supply curve to the right. When governments do what they do and run budget deficits, it means public savings are negative, shifting the supply curve left. And lastly, changes in net capital inflows also affect the supply curve. If more foreigners are saving their money in the US than Americans are saving their money in other countries, then net capital inflows are positive, shifting the supply curve to the right. If net capital inflows are negative, this shifts the supply curve left. And an increase in the supply of loanable funds causes a lower real interest rate, while a decrease in the supply of loanable funds causes a higher real interest rate. Now, the demand curve represents borrowers, and borrowers demand more loanable funds at lower interest rates than they do at higher interest rates. The first shifter of the demand curve is changes in business opportunities. If businesses are optimistic about the economy, they are more likely to demand loanable funds at any given interest rate, shifting the demand curve to the right. If businesses are pessimistic and perceive poor business opportunities in the future, then they are less likely to demand loanable funds at any given interest rate, and this shifts the demand curve to the left. An investment tax credit gives a tax cut to encourage firms to engage in investment spending, so this increases the demand for loanable funds since more firms will undertake investment spending. Alright, and with that, you made it. Walk into that test with all the confidence in the world. You got this. Until next time, this has been a LaMoney production. Thanks again for watching. I really hope this helped. Check out the description for some great resources like macro and 250 words, and I will see you in Unit 5.